I wanted to honor the vulnerability and trust that you as collaborators of Draft have engendered in this space and place. And so good morning and peace to you, and peace to all of you who are watching or listening to this video. Here's the camera right there, always in front of us, in whatever now time you exist in. I've been working in socially engaged practices and have been trying to figure out the distinctions between public, counter-public, culture, counterculture, community, etc. for over 2 to 3 decades now. First as a cultural producer, as an activist, as a community organizer, and then as an academic and an anthropological archaeologist. For me, at the core is an impulse of decolonization, which includes not only the post-colonial critique, but explicitly an interrogation of capitalism, patriarchy, and deeply related to those two, epistemic injustice. And as one who is charged with the expertise of writing histories, it is imperative that I recognize and claim my privilege as well. And I start with this because I think it's important to make clear my standpoint as I enter into this discussion. So to follow in a more feminist artistic tradition, I'm going to weave, or actually braid together, 3 aspects of this conference that I think will allow us to consider what all of this might mean in a more synthetic fashion. Firstly, a linguistic strand. This goes back to the first day when we can think of something that Gitanjali spoke of, and that was the politics of naming. But what seems to have emerged is that it's not just a politics of naming. I would include the development of a new lexical register, a vocabulary. And embedded in all of this, the issue of translation, which we've seen kind of firsthand right now. After watching the Hong Kong film yesterday, I thought a lot about the word orchestra and how that had its own sonic baggage. And there was a different ease with which the Cantonese word and world emerged. It is important to be cognizant of the imperialism and the limits of expression of English as the mode of conversation, and how that might serve some better than others. There were 2 specific phrases that I thought captured some aspect of this, and particularly the link between language and military, or an expansionist ideology. And this, again, is from the Hong Kong film. Mastery of a language affords remarkable power. And the second, to speak a language is to take on the world. And from our presentation just now, the show, the big characters, right? This idea of phrases from the Little Red Book being physically carved into a landscape. It linked in my mind other disembodied phrases that were part of, for example, the Zurich team's work, such as the Swiss desire of cultural supremacy. These disembodied words and phrases link disturbingly to the discussion of disembodied bodies and mutating bodies, and what is happening to the post-cyborg feminist body. The queer fembot body could be emancipatory. But those feminist statements as emancipatory really depend on the context, because that same disembodiment is a result of racial and sexual violence in a South African context. These feminist projects from Zurich and Cape Town could not be more different, and yet both were located on women's bodies as sites, and here I'm thinking of the physicality of a place, and sites as a visual technique, as sites and sites of violence. But there has still been some sense of empowerment within this room as we use these words with each other. What are these words that are affording all of you power? Or in a more visionary sense, maybe to speak a language is to create new worlds. And I'm thinking about visioning through words in a more Afro-futurist sense. And I'm shamelessly evoking Octavia Butler here as my muse, as she often tends to be. And thinking through the contributions of Mexico City, St. Petersburg, and even Cape Town, and again, linguistically, right? So the words, violence, ephemerality, uncertainty, fear, hope, and the embodied responses those affective modalities engender was particularly striking. The ways in which the city itself allows for community to be realized or recognized as pre-existing, or perhaps gives space to certain formulations of vocabularies of space and community formed through materiality. And here I'm still thinking about Hong Kong, but I'm also in a very real sense thinking of Mumbai. And I suspect, given the pre-circulated materials, Hamburg may fall into this as well. So I'm curious about how the vocabularies of space and community are formed through the materiality. But not only the materiality of building materials, because that's very easy, but the material relationships that are articulated and negotiated, either through sound or books or minerals. And these relationships need not always feel good, as we had in the Bombay example, as you can think, of course, of how it doesn't feel good when you think of gold, right, in the Zurich example. As Zurich took us through the metabolic vibrant matter, it made me think of the neutrality not only in terms of protons and neutrons, but also in terms of the space-time continuum. This has come up again, right? Yesterday, Nils, in fact, spoke of time and issues of scale. And I wanted to add to the idea of time, the idea of space, and this is something that Sophie from the Hamburg group, was Sophie here? Yes, hey. You mentioned this yesterday in your comments as well, like bringing in space into the relationship of time. And in fact, what we just saw, what we just talked about in terms of slowing down the filming and editing of this sort of process in Beijing, like countering the city through a process, right? So again, this relationship between space and time, I think, is very important. So indexing the fourth dimension, the 3 dimensions of time, and the 3 dimensions of space and the fourth of time, I want to bring our attention to what happens if we separate them. And this, I have to admit, is something I think about a lot. When you separate them, you have what's called a black hole. Now, barring the racialist element of that nomenclature, this is the second strand I want to draw our attention to. If contrary to what we have now de facto accepted in our conversations, the relationship of the concept of time, that is to say, rather than thinking of time as accumulation, which to me suggests more capitalist logic, to think of time as a simultaneity of existence. As someone who trips through time often, and maybe not as gracefully as others, because I keep tripping on violence, I would argue that time should be considered less as accumulation and more as being simultaneous, when in that simultaneity of existing in multiple time frames. So for example, just to make this more concrete, if one can, when I'm excavating something from 5,000 years ago in 2016 and having a conversation with someone about lining up Nowruz with the spring equinox, with the sighting of the moon for Eid, while also trying to ensure that we break in time for Jummah prayers, I move through 4 or 5 scales of time simultaneously. Space is not as forgiving or malleable yet, but more specific to the point, the peeling apart of the space-time continuum as an active format allows us to think about what the productive nature of the uncertainty of the black hole is or could be. And maybe thinking about the development of an ideal public, or whatever that public, as an audience of public art might be, which in this conference has proven to be tenuous, which is really fantastic because that suggests a certain kind of embedded criticality that we all have. So to think of the public not as relegated to space or time, within which the only way to make sense of things is through building solidarities through practice. I mentioned this because I saw a lot of this in the presentation from Mexico City and Mumbai. You could extrapolate this to be a comment on new technologies as a way to bridge that. And so whether we're thinking of Ulf Hannard's network theory in the city, a rhizomatic approach with Deleuze and Guattari, or simply the entangled kin critters that Haraway and Barad allow us to speak of, if we begin to think of the millennials as using social media to activate public and social change, how does that impact our understandings of publics and politics and even art? And for the final strand, I want to acknowledge the significance of the students in the conference. Not only the 40 summer school attendees, thank you all for being here, but rather those that were the impetus or framework for so much of what we spoke of in these last 2 days. Starting with the 43, all the way to learning how to chirp like a bird as a social artistic experiment regarding collectivity in a city that recently was a site, again, site, of student-initiated protests in 2014. And here I'm referring to the umbrella movement. I've always found my activism to be pedagogically located in the classroom, in a classically pedagogy of the oppressed kind of sense. But what public is that? When I was a student activist back in the day, pizza was the answer to mobilizing crowds, right? And bringing people together in action. That was the Gen X conundrum. How do we activate publics and public debate? And we're still asking that. In fact, that's a core of our provocation for this conference. But I'm not sure if that is where our focus should be. What is public discourse, and what does it mean that for my students and students around the world who are activating and mobilizing hundreds and thousands of people to join them in the streets, that discursive action is the hashtag, and meaning resides in 140 characters? And so although I am concerned about issues of technological access and economics, I find myself retweeting hashtag Yamekansei, right? Hashtag Umbrella Revolution, hashtag Roads Must Fall, and hashtag Black Lives Matter. Thank you.